podcast for healing neurology, where we talk about everything that can help heal your neurology, which is really everything: food, lifestyle, mental health, thinking and feeling patterns, environment in which you live and work, medical treatments, pharmaceuticals, nature, culture, and politics. There is no topic too big or too small. I'm Jillian Ehrlich. I'm a family nurse practitioner certified in Ayurveda and functional medicine, here with nurse practitioner Keesha Ewers, the founder of the Academy for Integrative Medicine. She is an integrative medicine expert and my doctor. She's also a doctor of sexology, a psychotherapist, a board-certified functional medicine provider, an Ayurvedic practitioner, medicine woman, best-selling author, speaker, and mother of 4. An avid hiker and outdoors woman. So good morning, Keesha. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. So our topic today, the thing that I really wanted to talk about is something that we don't often talk about in our society, and we definitely don't talk about in medical visits very often. And it is the relationship between forgiveness and sex, or forgiveness really and intimacy. I think sex is the key word that makes everybody's ears go up, but really it's the intimacy piece. And you did your doctoral dissertation in this, and I just read all 150 pages of it.
I'm so sorry.
I really enjoyed it. It was fascinating on multiple fronts. So can't wait for the book, first of all. But until then, I want to know, how did you get interested in this topic?
Well, now looking at everything in the rearview mirror, I always call myself the mother Fokker, because I'm like Mrs. Fokker from Meet the Parents. And when I look at how I raise my children, I crack up, because they used to try to point it out to me that the statues with bare boobs in our house and the vulva velvet pillow sitting on the library shelf with all of the sex books was a little abnormal for their peers.
So did they bring friends home from school?
They did. And in fact, those friends would stay till 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning asking me questions about the subject matter, because they couldn't find it anywhere. The fact that you introduced it as intimacy is actually a really important segue into this, because they can find, information on the internet through porn and other sites about the actual mechanics of sex, but the real meat of relating to one another, intimacy, that's nowhere to be found in their curriculum at school, in their churches and synagogues and temples, and it's definitely lacking in a lot of homes. And so what I started realizing is not only were, the subset of this population of my children's peers, but also the people that were coming into my office were suffering from the same lack of information. And then they were coming in with things like gastrointestinal difficulties, autoimmune disease, cancer, skin issues, all kinds of inflammatory things like throats closing off because eating gluten, just weird things, right?
Does that happen to anybody, really?
I don't know. It's just sometimes. And so vulvodynia, like things that were overtly genital related, and then others that you would not usually make a correlation. And when I would start asking really easy questions, like, what are the stressors in your life? And they would say, oh, I'm not stressed. I'd hear that a lot. And then I started putting on our paperwork, as this little scale of rate your life 0 to 10 in all these little areas. And romantic significant other partner is one I zero in on as one of the stressors that we look under the rock of. And I would often see, 2, 3, 4 out of 0 to 10, with 10 being the highest. And I would say, so what's happening here with your personal life and your relationship? And I would get tears, so I keep a box of Kleenex on my desk, because I would start asking questions like, so what's happening? Do you, and, oh, I don't have any libido, or I'm so tired. And my husband, and I would hear this a lot too. My poor husband, bless his heart, he's so patient with me. And I would say, around what? Well, I just don't feel like having sex, and then I would say, so ask again, like simple questions. Do you like your husband? And then I would get tears again. The same person that said, my poor husband, bless his heart, would be crying and saying, well, he had an affair 5 years ago and I've forgiven him, but I don't feel like having sex with him. And as I started looking at the medical literature, I couldn't find anything to really corroborate what I was seeing in my practice. And so I started really searching for the data, the science about what to do, where to go with this. And, I realized that my hypothesis was that forgiveness was actually a big piece of what needed to happen, and not the lip service pulpit. Forgiveness is what I call it, that if you're a Christian, you're going to forgive people, turn the other cheeks. If you're harmed 7 times, then 7 times 7, and that actually was a surface level forgiveness, but it wasn't the depth of really understanding why this lesson came in front of me in the first place. And so I haven't really gone into self-confrontation about the patterns that I'm attracting in my life. And so then it keeps happening over and over again. And my life force vitality, what Ayurvedic medicine calls your ojas, is getting really drained because I keep repeating these same, falling in the same pothole over and over again. So I went back to school and I got a PhD in sexology, because what I was looking at was the correlation between the intimacy with yourself and what you bring to the table in intimacy with another, and how that plays out in health and wellness in the larger picture. And it was really fascinating how it all came together and what the outcomes were. And then, so not only am I a motherfucker, but I'm also the mother of functional sexology, because I then created this whole new branch of functional medicine called functional sexology, which, the powers that be at Institute for Functional Medicine, I remind them constantly that this is a subject that needs to be talked about from stage, and we're still working on that.
Well, I'm really happy to give you a platform to talk about it today. I can tell you also in my practice how common it is that people bring up things about intimacy and sex. And it always astounds me how natural a part of the conversation it is, because it really is part of how our nervous system functions, about how our nervous system either gets worked up or calms down or kind of moves one direction or another. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the connection between sex and inflammation. How would a stomach problem be a result of a sex problem or an intimacy problem?
I'll enter into that question by first just doing a little sideways comment about how you say how easy it is for you to be able to talk about this with your patients. But in fact, data says that that's not easy for most medical providers. And the only reason that it's easy for you is because you're comfortable with it yourself. And that is a big barrier that people have when they go into an office with a gastrointestinal problem, for example, like you're talking about, and have it enter through a doorway that actually winds up talking about sex and intimacy, because most providers, according to the data, are not comfortable themselves with being able to talk about this. They're not educated in any of the medical education platforms we have, whether it's medical school, nursing school, or nurse practitioner education, or PA. There just isn't. It's all about learning how to treat sexually transmitted illnesses, prevent pregnancy, and deliver babies. That's it. That's all we get for sex, which is really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, those are some of the harder things. I mean, having the baby is really not, it's pleasurable in its own way, but we do, think about how many times people have a baby versus how many times people are going to have sex in their life.
I know.
Really.
So the fact that we're so undereducated and really don't show up in a way that helps our patients is why I take to the streets about this. So the correlation between this and a gastrointestinal issue, and the way that you asked that question is, you had said about the stress part, right? The neurology of it. And the way that I always talk about this is, if you're a zebra being chased by a lion, and you think you're about to get eaten, then that zebra's wiring is very wise in the way that it reacts, right? It says, okay, I'm about to get eaten. I can't support even this organism until I get to safety. And so every bit of the hormones that are required for you to feel sexually ready, desire, arousal, and to be able to reproduce, so fertility, is going to go down because your body knows it cannot support life right now. It can't even support you, as well as digestive issues. So it's not safe to stop and poop either, right? It's not safe to stop and sex if you have stop and have sex if you have a lion on your tail. And it's also not safe to stop and go to the bathroom. So your digestive system and your reproductive system both actually get you could say, co-opted into that safety and survival mechanism. And when I was doing my doctoral research, I was looking at a lot of fMRI scans of brains, and I was really mapping brains and seeing what was happening in the sexual response and arousal cycle for females, because it had been mapped out in detail by Masters and Johnson, not from fMRI scans, but in a lot of other different data points. And what they were looking at when their subjects were actually prostitutes, because that's who would come into their lab. So that was our female subject, and then males. And so the Masters and Johnson sexual arousal cycle actually doesn't really work for all women. And we've discovered that over the course of the last 5 decades, that it's not a one size fits all for women. And so when you think about that, I started thinking, well, we have MRIs now. We can look at PET scan images. And I started looking at all of these brains and seeing that, the exact same parts of the brain that light up for desire in women in an MRI are actually the same ones that light up when they're triggered with PTSD or daily chronic stress. There was another group, Mole and Associates, who actually did a study that showed that people that report chronic daily overwhelm. Now, I don't have a patient that doesn't say they're not overwhelmed. I mean, that's it. Overwhelm is like the gateway drug to perfectionism, and I see it every day in my practice. Yeah. And so what they're saying is, if you think of yourself as overwhelmed day in and day out, chronically perceiving your stress to be too high to keep up with, you're actually having the same brain changes as people that have gone through war or a gigantic hurricane and lost your home or some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder event. It's actually the same stuff. And that part of your brain that lights up when you're in that level of stress is actually the one required for you to feel sexual desire and arousal.
So it's interesting. I had a patient in my office yesterday who is that chronically overwhelmed, very tired, digestion not really working, but was telling me that she has a very overactive sex drive and always has. I'm curious if you see that as well.
So this is really interesting.
How are these pieces so linked? Why are they the same?
Mm-hmm. This is really, really interesting because Rosemary Basson actually created a circular rather than a linear map for sexual desire and arousal for females. Mm-hmm. And what she said is there are many different reasons that women come to the gateway of, okay, I want to have sex, right, with myself or with another. And it can be like with other. It can also be for power, for self-soothing, for emotional intimacy, for pleasure, for a whole variety of reasons. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we learn at a very young age through masturbation that actually sex will calm us down, kind of like a man, right? So you see a stereotype, and I'm going to talk in stereotypes right now. Please forgive me because men are not all like this either. Mm-hmm. But sometimes the stereotype of the gender for men is that they will use sex to make up with a partner or use sex to calm themselves down. And that can be true for females too, but it's just not for all females. And that's the thing that I really noticed and that was coming out of the data in my research was there's just not a one size fits all way of describing female sexual interest, arousal, and desire.
That's fascinating. And I remember from your dissertation, you really highlighted how the Masters and Johnson cycle for sex was linear. And it was always assumed that more was better and that orgasm was the goal. Mm-hmm. And that this new way of thinking about it, can you describe even a little bit more about the circular cycle?
Sure. So the linear, just to kind of describe if no one's familiar with Masters and Johnson's work from the 1950s, they did the biggest sexological research that had been done to date at that point. And, it was a time when no one ever even talked about sex. So this was breakthrough. So the contribution to our society, culture, and medicine cannot even be overestimated. But what they came away with was this sexual arousal, desire and arousal cycle that you can see illustrated on the outside of a male's body, right? So a man's penis, when he has desire and arousal, you can actually see what's going to happen. And then there's ejaculation and there's a refractory period. So you can't actually have a circular for them. Like it's very, very here's how it goes, right? But with a woman, we don't have that kind of clear cut. First, there has to be interest and desire and then arousal. For women, actually, we can feel, especially, so there's another statistic that really blew me out of the water that I saw a study, and I talk about it from stages all the time now because I want everyone to know this. All women should know this. And that is that 69% of women, after being in a committed relationship for a year or more, no longer have spontaneous sexual desire. Now that's really important, because spontaneous sexual desire is the one that we call being in the mood. And, that's the one that men will send their partners in to see me when they find out I'm a sexologist and say, go get fixed, right? Go get fixed. There's something wrong with you. You're broken. Now, there are a couple of different factors in a committed relationship that are at play. There's always going to be a partner that has a higher desire than the other one. And also a higher desire, like the partners won't match in their desire for emotional intimacy, for how they budget money, for how they vacation, for what they eat, what time they eat, like all that stuff is going to be high desire, low desire partner. And you always have to balance that like a teeter-totter. And sex is one of those factors. So you have that piece, and then you have this piece about women, once they're in a committed relationship, getting more into a nesting space where, things kind of calm down in their desire. So there'll be a mismatch in partners often because of that. So in this, then we have to understand that with Rosemary Bassan's circular cycle that she came up with, she said, we actually can feel arousal first and desire second. So if you're in a committed relationship or you've been in a lot of sexual relationships and you go, yeah, I kind of have fun doing this. I like doing it. So if I can just remember, I like this person, I know once I'm in it, I enjoy it and I relax and calm down. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go ahead and just trust that this is the case. And I'm going to start the process and get aroused, and then desire can follow. Mm-hmm. That's not the truth for men usually. I mean, that's just like, that's the difference between us two.
That's not what, I feel like Baywatch doesn't teach me that they have those kinds of feelings.
I've actually never seen Baywatch, but yeah, I don't think you're going to pick it up in porn either,
People running around in bathing suits.
Right.
Most of the shows that I have, that we see on television or we see in the movies is not really highlighting how great it is that you can remind women that they like their partner and then they're interested in sex once it starts, but that it's not required to have kind of a voracious hunger for it prior.
Well, and I think men get dinged by that too. The statistic is that men have a sexual thought every 1 to 15 seconds, and so then if they don't match that and they're not always in the mood and ready to go, then they feel hypo-masculine, like something's wrong with them. Because the onus is on the male in our society that they're always rough and ready and let's go, let's do this, And so I think the media really, there are a lot of myths that I bust, around this. And one of those is that men have hypoactive sexual desire too. Like they get affected by their jobs and work and what's going on in their stress. And if their marriage isn't happy, they also have these little dips in desire. And in fact, the research says 35% of men between the ages of 15 and 55 will have low libido at some point in their lives, right? But I always say that 35% is wrong because men don't generally talk about this, and they don't usually go into a medical provider with it as a problem. And so I would say 35% is a very underreported statistic.
So what is so I had one of my kind of early 20s mentors used to say to me, Romeo and Juliet like ruined us for sex, that it was always this like till death do us part in the moment, and let alone that these are 15-year-old teenagers kind of being highlighted in this.
Suicidal ones too.
Not necessarily.
Let's know who we're talking about right now.
To follow. And that since that time, since the 1600s, we've really struggled with how to connect. And so from your perspective, like, what is our deal? What is our problem with intimacy? Why can't we connect? Why can't we talk about sex? What happened to us? Part of life. What happened to us?
Well, that's what came out of my research really was the study that I conducted was called the Healing Unresolved Trauma Study, the HURT study. And what emerged from that was the HURT model. And what I discovered is that all of us, and it doesn't matter, there's a big study. Mine was just, a small pilot study of a little under 100 women in the Pacific Northwest. So by no means a huge study. There's another one called the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Events study, that was really, really big cohort, between 1995 and 1997, that was conducted by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. And one of the things that was discovered in that one, and then I'll show how this applies to sexual desire from the HURT study, is that when you have trauma in your background in childhood, it actually impacts your health. That's really what the ACEs study came forward with, is they looked at 10 different kinds of neglect, abandonment, and abuse, from sexual abuse, domestic violence, psychological, spiritual, emotional abuse, to having a parent or a caregiver be incarcerated, addicted to drugs or alcohol or some substance, or mentally ill or dead. And so those, they are watching a mother get beaten. Though if they were asked, did you under the age of 18 experience any of these events? Anyone that marked 1 had an ACE score of 1, 2, 2, and so forth. The higher the score, the higher the risk for autoimmune disease, cancer, sedentary lifestyle, addiction, sexual promiscuity, sexually transmitted illnesses, et cetera, and then also divorce and relationships that wouldn't be healthy going on into adulthood. So when I looked at the HURT study, what I discovered is that these 10 from the ACEs study, which I hadn't even heard of at that point, by the way, were actually really, again, an underrepresentation of how the human brain experiences trauma. So I started thinking about this, and other researchers have said the same thing, like a capital T trauma versus a lowercase t trauma. So a capital T trauma would be those big ones that we just talked about from the ACEs study. Lowercase t trauma, though, everybody has experienced, everyone. Yeah. You can't get out of being human without it. And so in childhood, the way that we are wired is, if in tribal times, we're sitting around the campfire, if somebody is rejected from the tribe and put on the outside of the firelight circle, you have a high risk of being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. So and you're wired to understand that it's really important to stay part of the community. If you're rejected from the community, if you're betrayed, then this is going to be a gigantic trauma. So we all have had that. Mm-hmm. The first time you failed a test, or didn't get picked for a sport team, or you had a friend on the playground one day and the next day she turned against you, or people were talking badly about you, like this is the land of childhood. I always say that the cafeteria is a jungle, that there's all, like, can I sit with the cool kids or not? Right. And so rejection's happening all the time when you're growing up and trying to figure out how to be a little human in a world that's dominated by big humans. So we have all kinds of trauma when we're growing up. And in the HURT model, what I discovered is you have this first trauma, okay, and it's going to be an experience where you didn't have a well-attuned, grounded caregiver right by your side to help you navigate the experience you're having. And so little kids in developmental stages are supposed to be self-centered. That's actually who they are and how they're supposed to operate, because they're trying to figure out how to be big humans. So they will always think that anything that happens is about them. So when they make up meanings to match what happens in any given moment, it's going to be self-centered and it's going to be all around them. So then from a meaning, you're going to create a belief structure. That belief structure will go into adulthood with you, along with what's called an adaptive behavior to match that belief. Now, the example I always give is my own. I was sexually abused when I was 10 in my elementary school by the vice principal. The vice principal would say, this is your fault because you're a bad kid. So the example that I use around this meaning, belief, and behavior is the meaning that I created was that people in authority can't be trusted. They're supposed to keep you safe. They say they're going to keep you safe, but then they're not keeping you safe, right? And to the wise mind of my 10-year-old, that was actually accurate. But it's not accurate as a way of just like painting all adults, right? That all adults in authority can't be trusted. It will be sometimes true and sometimes not true. that non-black and white adaptive thinking is not present yet in the child brain. We don't have our prefrontal cortex on board until we're 26 years old. So everything's gonna be pretty black and white.
Mm-hmm.
This is bad, this is good, you're bad, right? Mm-hmm. And so that meant that the meaning I created was people, in authority can't be trusted. The belief that I attached to that was, all right, if this is because I'm bad and I'm doing something wrong, then I need to be perfect to even survive. Mm-hmm. Not perfect to get love or respect or be worthy, but perfect to even live, right? Mm-hmm. So then the behavior that I attached to that as my adaptive behavior response for the very wise decision I made at that moment in my life was to be a perfectionist. And boy, was I perfect at being a perfectionist. And so, that's the thing that we don't understand, is that those behaviors and strategies we have to get through our world are actually created long before we have some sort of adult crash, right? My adult crash came in my early 30s when I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. And, I went in and I saw a rheumatologist and I was told, this is because you just told me your grandfather had rheumatoid arthritis, so this is genetic. I'm sorry, but you've drawn the short end of the genetic lotto, and that's like the end of the story. Here's your methotrexate prescription and your non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. Come back when you get worse, not if, but when. And no, in answer to your question about food or any other lifestyle factors, there's nothing you can do. So I went home thinking, this has to be wrong. There has to be something else. And I always tell the story that if an herb had bitten me in the butt, I would have never known it, because I was so steeped in Western medicine. I was an ICU nurse, and that's all I knew. Yeah. And so going into PubMed and NCBI, where we keep our medical research, and looking for data on, is there anything else besides these medications, was actually a huge stretch for me that time in my life.
That's amazing.
And yeah, it was
a long way, baby.
I know, it was like Star Trek and this frontier that had never been seen before for me. And,
you were a flight nurse. You were a flight ICU nurse, weren't you?
Yeah, I was. Balloon pump. I mean, I was really in the trenches of high adrenaline junkie kind of medicine as a nurse, and loved it. Mm-hmm. And so
with your 4 kids?
With my 4 kids, yeah. And running marathons, and just I was a perfectionist, and nobody wants your ICU nurse to be anything less than a perfectionist. So we find our way into the job. I was also, perfect mother. I was a super mom. I was like a stereotype. I was Martha Stewart at home. I was crazy how I drove myself. Yeah. When I ran my first marathon, I had a goal to make it to the Boston Marathon, get the time that would get me to Boston. And I did, and I ran Boston, and it was just like that, right? Drive myself to that degree of perfectionism. I was only competing against myself. And so when I was diagnosed with RA, I had to sit back, and I found some research that showed that yoga and autoimmunity were kind of a good mix. And so I went to my first yoga class, my perfectionism blaring, and of course discovered that that's not a great space for that, and started learning to meditate, and oh my gosh, and then really understanding that there had to be something between this early childhood trauma and what was happening in my body. I actually really understood that. Ayurveda said that autoimmunity is undigested anger. So really my path through reversing my RA within 6 months of, really understanding that I had to heal this trauma. I had to get through and become a recovering perfectionist and stop driving myself and really find my worth from inside, not from what I do, but who I am, and really relax my nervous system. That made my autoimmune disease go away, along with some dietary changes and some other things. But I had done those first. I discovered Ayurveda, I discovered my dosha type, I started balancing it. But it wasn't really until I learned how to have a collaborative relationship, is what I call it now. I always say autoimmunity is a combative relationship with all of your parts, your body, mind, heart, and spirit. And I had to get into a collaborative relationship with myself. And once I did that with my nervous system, my RA went away and hasn't been back in 20 years. It's just really interesting. So that's what I brought to this research around sex, was this understanding that, nervous system has to do with this too.
Mm-hmm.
that the neurological component is really, really important, but that's driven by more than just a bundle of nervous system fibers. That it's actually driven by your own perceptions of who you are in this world. And those come from childhood. And that until you actually crash, I call this the misery to motivation ratio of human nature. And I wish it weren't so, but it seems to be so. Even when people are intelligent and they know, they'll still drive themselves to a crash before they'll finally stop doing whatever it is that's their self-destructive behavior. And I keep talking about this, like, please don't be like me. Don't make it go there, and it just still happens. It's just how we are, right?
Robert Naviaux, who does cell danger response, calls this the metabolic addiction. And Ayurveda calls this kavaigunya, which literally translates as defective space, but really means kind of the vulnerability that once the track is laid, sometimes when we're not looking, we fall back into it.
Well, the thing of it is even when we're looking, we do. And what I've discovered is that we're born into a culture of trauma. And this is actually where my research is going now, is this idea that we're kind of like in a cup of tea, and the tea bag is labeled trauma, and we're steeping in it, and we're like frogs. Ayurveda says always look to the frogs for seeing how the health of your environment is, because they're the ones that will get sick and die first before the humans do. And the frog in the boiling water doesn't notice it's boiling until it's already there, right? And I believe we live in a predatory culture. We live in a culture that celebrates achievement and productivity, kind of only. Like, that's it, right? And being efficient.
Kind of back to like orgasm and sex.
Yes.
Linear, like you succeed when you orgasm.
We have a finish line. We have goals. We want to meet those goals. And what's wrong with having goals, Dr. Keesha? I hear that all the time. I say there's nothing wrong with having goals. It's the attachment to the outcome. Like, if you set yourself up for, this is what I'd like to spend my time on, and this is the legacy I want to leave in this world before I go. This is my life purpose and my mission. But then don't get attached to the outcome of it, that people have to celebrate it or be excited about it, or they change, or whatever. Like, making sure you don't get attached to the outcome is really the part that we get just missed. And the other thing that happens in our culture that gets really missed is we're not told from a very early time of growing up harsh truths about what life actually is. And I really love Buddhism for this, because I learned these two statements, and now I'm developing a new project around them, which is everything that you love, you will lose, and everything that lives must die. And it's like, that is just truth, right? And our fairy tales lie about that, right? You will live happily ever after if this and this and this and this happen. And we're just constantly chasing that. And when that's happening, we're attached to a different kind of outcome, to some sort of fairy tale that we've spun for ourselves when we were really tiny. And we're unhappy and suffering if we don't achieve that. And yet life actually promises something quite different. It promises love, it promises happiness, it promises joy, it promises all the things that we dream about as children. But in it, it also promises to challenge you. It promises that you're going to lose and you're going to win, and you're going to suffer and you're going to succeed. And that all of that is true, and that what we need to be taught as children is how to have compassion for the reality of life. We need to be taught how to grieve loss. We need to understand we will lose, and that we don't get a trophy for just showing up, And so this has been a really interesting exploration at the age of 54 now, looking at, the society that I live in and that I've brought children into, and now grandchildren will be coming eventually. And how can we change the cultural conversation? We went through a sexual revolution in the 1960s where we could talk about sex, but can we now talk about the idea of productivity and achievement being the finish line that you have to go through, and how we're constantly falling short of that? And therefore we have so much suicide now. We have millennials trying to kill themselves, and we have white middle-aged males trying to kill themselves. It's like not gender specific, and it's also not generation specific, and it's not socioeconomic specific. And these are called deaths of despair that are happening right now. And it infiltrates, I always end every one of my talks around sex with what's in your head goes to your bed. It infiltrates our bedroom and our relationships with each other and our ability to be intimate with ourselves and others.
So if we could kind of thinking about how to interrupt this at various stages in its production, because some of us listeners out here have young children and we make transgressions that we know and, figuring out how to repair them. Some of us are adults trying to navigate this stuff as well. So if we went back to your 10-year-old self, what would have changed? What would have changed things for you? What did you need then? What can we offer our children now?
Well, that's a great question. Having a different vice principal would have saved things.
Yeah.
But the thing of it is I want to caveat that by saying that also best thing that ever happened to me, and I know that raises people's hackles to hear you're telling me sexual abuse is the best thing that ever happened to you and you have 4 children. What about childbirth? It's like, well, yes, that's one of the best things that ever happened to me, because I got sick as a result, and it forced me to sit down and start doing the self-confrontation work that then creates wisdom and growth and expansion of consciousness. So what the 10-year-old self needed is an understanding. I told my mom, my dad was out to sea in the Navy, but I didn't have words. I didn't even, I don't think, know the word sex. I was raised with no TV. It was the 1970s. It was a very different time, and I know that was the flower child stage, but actually we had lived in Japan for most of, and then moved back to the United States. So I was very, very naive and sheltered and didn't know about anything in terms of like vocabulary to surround what was happening for me. So when I told my mom that I didn't want to go to school and I was crying and I had a stomachache and headache, that was a huge, big red flag for me, because I loved school. That was the place that I actually excelled in life and loved.
You still love school.
I still love school. He didn't destroy that for me. I love school. And, the thing that I would say to parents today, as you ask this question from the standpoint of a mother of a young son, is if you notice behavioral change in your child, to really, really don't stop, until you figure out what's going on, because they don't usually have words to be able to explain. And they also, remember, they're self-centered, and if they're told it's their fault, they will believe it. And so, it's really being present to the energy of the little being that you're raising. And if that shifts, being able to just be dogged about, hunting down what it is that's going on. So that's one thing.
Can you tell a kid it's not their fault? Like, will they?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think like when I give parenting advice to people, because people will say, wow, your kids are amazing. What did you do? I say that I've sat back and thought about that, because I don't really take credit for them. I think they're just incredible people. But what I do say is 2 things. And one is that I was really free with saying I'm sorry, that I really messed that up right there. And here's what I realized I did. And here's why I did it. And so I'm really looking at the why and fixing that in myself. And I'm going to ask you to be an accountability partner for me, that if you ever see that again, that you'll call me out on it so that I can actually work with it. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's like letting my kids know I'm not perfect that's a huge thing. I was raised by 2 people that would have never said they're sorry. And I think that's a generational thing too.
And then I have to teach my 4-year-old what accountability partner means.
Yeah. And it's being able to say, like, mommy is watching out for how she is messing up right there. Mm-hmm. So if you see that, go ahead and tell mommy. Right? Yeah, you don't have to use that jargon, right? So it's like developmentally appropriate. But I just remember the first time I started doing this work, I shared it with my kids. It was dining room table conversation. And everything that I was learning about myself, I would share at dining room, table conversation time when we were eating. And I, like, when I learned the Enneagram, I taught it to them, and I told them how it had, like, the dark part, the distortion of my ego that was acting through my Enneatype. I would actually illuminate it for them so they could see it and say, oh my gosh, this is amazing, you know? And I get very excited about really uncovering my own shadow and bringing it out into the open and dancing with it and integrating it in front of my kids so that they now are just like that's what they do. And they're fascinating people as a result. You know, they're not trying to hold these masks up to the world that say, don't look at this, right? Which is how we are as humans. So that's one thing, is to always be able to say, I'm sorry, and share your work. You know how in 5th grade, they always wanted you to show your math work? I would say show your work constantly to your kids.
Show your emotional work.
Yeah. Show your emotional work.
I think that brings up another really good point, which I know about you and I've seen in your work all for the last 15 some years we've known each other, which is that we are here to grow and change. We are here to develop as individuals. There's no point at which we stop growing and changing and evolving as human beings. And so the hope is that we can model that for our children and do that till our dying breath. And I really do think that's part of what makes a life fulfilling.
Absolutely. And I, you know, like, so then my dissertation had a lot to do with forgiveness. And so I mentioned earlier, it wasn't pulpit forgiveness, right? That it was actually doing this, where the hurt model, the way that it emerged was there's this initial hurt. You feel it when you're a child. You will have a nervous system response to it, fight, flight, or freeze. Oftentimes it's freeze because we're powerless when we're children. And so fighting is not an option and fleeing is not an option. So there's the freeze, right? And sometimes we'll disassociate, like with sexual abuse, the wise mind of the child, you'll leave your body, you know, and let that happen to the body and go somewhere else. I've started talking to angels and being with, you know, God and spirits and other dimensions because I didn't really want to be in the body I was in, right? And so you start learning how to adapt according to your age, right? So then you're going to create your meaning, your belief, and your behavior. Then you go into adulthood with all of this intact. And so then you have opportunities. And the way the hurt model is it splits off so that you have these two circles. One is maladaptive and one is adaptive. So maladaptive means that you keep doing the same thing over and over again. Somebody comes along and, let's say, pushes your perfectionism button. You're not doing it right. You're not good enough, whatever it is. And so that will have the same exact nervous system response as you had when you were 2, 3, 4, however, right? Maybe even in utero. And so that gets set up really early, this nervous system habit, okay? It's habituated response. And if you keep doing that over and over again, remember how I talked about the lion and the zebra? Actually, the zebra that's being chased by the lion, it eventually has to fall over in exhaustion and get eaten, or it will make it to safety. And it doesn't just in perpetuity keep doing this. We as humans tend to have a lot of stamina for staying in fight or flight for decades. You know, we know it takes anywhere from 10 to 30 years to actually develop a full-blown autoimmune disease. So people listening to us right now could be developing an autoimmune disease and not even know it, because of this response that we just keep going, right? Gas pedal, right?
Yes.
And and cancer too. So the model says, okay, you keep doing what you've always been doing, you will get sick. That's just a guarantee. And your libido will go away too, because the way that we think about sexual desire is the Ayurvedic way of thinking about it as life force vitality, or ojas. And you keep leaking that out like you have an oil leak in your car. And eventually you're going to burn up your engine and die. Like Ayurveda says, no more ojas, no more life. Like you just die, right? So my objective was, well, how do we stop doing that? How do we quit leaking ojas? And how can we replace it? Because Ayurveda also says that's very difficult. It's like a drop at a time. It's very hard to replace it. So what you really want to do is protect it, right? So the way to protect your life force vitality, which I use the vital sign to measure your life force vitality, is your libido level. And I don't mean sexual, like it can be sexual, but really what I mean is your passion for living your life purpose, your passion for everything that you love in life. You know, when people start to get depressed, they lose that. And that's a low ebbing ojas, or life force vitality. Your libido level will be low. So the other side of the model says you actually at any point can stop and self-confront. You can actually look and say, oh, everywhere I go, there I am. every single time there's a crash, I'm behind the wheel,
Mhm.
you know, and, oh, this may not be so much about external circumstances the way I've always thought it was. Maybe there's something going on with my patterning, what I attract to me, you know, the way that my ego speaks into the world. I'm a hard driving perfectionist, I realized, you know, and when I called my mother, when I started doing this work and said, oh my gosh, I just realized I'm such a perfectionist. I mean, I had to sit and listen to her laugh for like 5 solid minutes. I can't believe this is the first time you're realizing that, because everybody else already knows what your, you know, what your shadow is. It's you thinking you're like a little toddler playing peekaboo behind a Kleenex box, right? Everyone can see the toddler, but the toddler can't see you, so it thinks that it's hidden. Yeah. So it's like that, right? And so, you know, and then she stopped laughing and I said, are you done now? Have you picked yourself up off the floor? And she said, yeah, sorry, honey. And I said, okay. Because there's something else. The apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, Mom. And then she was like, oh. So when you do that self-confrontation,
we come by our patterns honestly.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. So when you do that self-confrontation piece, then it's going to require that you actually do look at your patterns and say, oh, this does come from, like in my case, it was a capital T trauma. I need to really go to work and heal this. I need to rewire my brain. I need to really get under it. And I need to repattern the way the habit of my nervous system is. It's on high vibration, hypervigilant, looking for being unsafe all the time. That is just not sustainable. So what I do, and I have a little program called Stress Busting Toolkit on my website. That's a CD that I've recorded of progressive relaxation and autogenic training. So autogenic training has been around and studied since the 1930s for pain, hypertension, migraines, you know, people with high vibrating nervous systems that are hypervigilant. And so I started doing that work and biofeedback. So we give a biofeedback thermometer to our patients who are learning how to do this, because when you can drive your temperature up by 5 degrees in your fingertips on your own, you're in control of it. You've mastered this. That means you now don't have just passively sit around watching your nervous system behave like an errant child in a grocery store. You know, my second son, we were in a grocery store one time and I think he was probably 6, and I put him in timeout because he was misbehaving. And we were over by the butcher area and he was crying and I was shopping for fish and watching him, and the butcher comes out and says, oh, little boy. And I said, no, he's fine. He's in timeout. He's good. He goes, oh, you've got this. Okay. And he went back inside, and I started realizing, like, our nervous system is like Colin, right? My son, that I can do something about it. I can say, hey, you're freaking me out right now. You don't need to be saying these messages. You don't need to be constantly looking for whether or not you're safe or not. There are no longer saber-toothed tigers prowling outside your house, right? Yeah. And so I need you to go sit over here and color a coloring book. I've got this. The 50-year-old version of me has got this. Yeah. I don't need the 4, 5, 6-year-old running the show and tripping the wires in my nervous system. And you can do that with like a healthy masculine father that gives structure, and a lovely nurturing mother who is compassionate. I think the big missing piece in our culture that children are not taught is self-compassion, like how to have compassion for the times when they're going to suffer. So it's being able to know the difference. It's like the serenity prayer, right? How it feels inside your body and which button you are in charge of tripping. So now it's not just you're a passive observer while your nervous system goes and does its thing. I loved the Pixar movie Inside Out, you know, watching all the emotions do their thing. And what I realized is we as adults, not child brains, the way that movie was, it was a child, right? But adult brains actually can direct those figures. They're not just in there interacting. You actually are the director. But we're not taught that. We're taught to just like be these passive victims of whatever our nervous system decides to do in any given moment. That's why I said, no, actually, even when you know this stuff, sometimes you walk into it and go, no, I'm going to have an Oreo anyway. I know what an Oreo does to me. I'm having an Oreo anyway. That's because the sadness molecule has just said, Oreo, from the 7-year-old space, right? And the adult's not there saying, oh, what's the Oreo supposed to fill right now, honey? Let's look at that and let's go repair that 7-year-old and say, now, what is it right here that the wise parent should have been able to say, but wasn't there? So like anyone that's a parent listening to me, you can never be there for your children 24/7 to actually guide them through every experience they cannot understand. It's just not possible. And I don't think human life is set up to be that way. I actually think our job as parents is to screw our kids up so that then they have some things that they have to work on in adulthood so they become wise elders and adults. I don't think you can become wise without having some challenges. You can't hatch out of an egg as a chicken and live if you haven't done the hard work, right?
Yes.
You're too weak.
And I think even if we try our best to be there for our kids, we still won't. So
we can't.
Ultimately, we just get to stop blaming ourselves.
Exactly. Do our very, 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 very best. Yeah. Show our work. Say, I'm sorry. Can you possibly forgive me? I love you. And I'm here in the skill level and the skill set that I have right this minute. And I'm working harder to actually up level that all the time.
And this is one of the things that I really found remarkable about your dissertation was that forgiveness, the 2 pieces about forgiveness, 3 pieces actually, which I hadn't thought clearly a lot about before. Number 1 is that about transgressions, that transgression is a perception of a wrongdoing. It's not like there's some great right or wrong in the world, but a transgression is a perception. So now when I feel resentment against people in my life who are doing things, I look at that as like my perception of a transgression. The second piece is about, who does really forgiveness benefit? Because we think, in my mind, forgiveness in the past has kind of just let the transgressor off the hook. But that forgiveness is really a way to get back in the driver's seat of your own experience and to halt your own victimization. And the third component is that, actually, those are the 2 components that I found most interesting.
So the really important piece about that you just said is that the number 1, according to research, the number 1 barrier for people forgiving is that they think that they're going to let the other person off the hook.
Yeah.
And that they're somehow supposed to be in the seat of judge and jury. And actually that's not accurate, because we are the transgressor as much as we are the transgressed. How many people have I hurt in my life that I haven't even known about? I don't know, right?
There's
I don't even know.
Difference still between big T and little t. Like my guess is that you haven't impacted a lot of big T traumas on others that have been impacted on you. How does that?
Yeah. So the thing I try to help people untangle that, and so that if, like in my book, Solving the Autoimmune Puzzle, I actually give a forgiveness practice that I got downloaded in India to me, and it's not mine. It just came through, and it's really what this dissertation was set up around, was the ability to self-confront. So if you've been transgressed against, right, you have some hurt, then the ability to bring the transgressor up in front of you. So I'm going to use my vice principal. Okay. So I'll use him, and I bring him up in front of me at this age, at 54, and hold him as like a little hologram in front of me. I can say, okay, so what are the ego traits? Because every human has the exact same ego traits. We all are cruel. We're all joyful. We're all mean. We're all jealous, dishonest, honest, truthful, trustworthy, untrustworthy, right? We're all of it. And the way that, the Cherokee said this a long time ago was, we all have a black wolf and a white wolf within us, and whoever we feed the most to grows the strongest. So by doing forgiveness work in this way, you're feeding your white wolf. So you're able to actually pull the person up in front of you and say, okay, so what of the human ego traits that we all share drove him to sexually molest children? Okay. So in my case, I was one of 2 white girls in an all black school, and he was black, and he told me that I was white trash, and that's why this was happening. And so he was a bigot. Okay. And then a second one that I would look at is, he misused power because he was the vice principal, right? Another one is cruelty, we'll say. Okay. And so if I were to use him as a mirror and say, okay, so where am I a bigot? This is the one that I got stuck on when I was doing this work, as a matter of fact, because I consider myself, having lived all over the world, not a bigot. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I'm a bigot against bigots. I am so intolerant of people that are intolerant. That makes me intolerant, right? It was such an interesting, like, oh my gosh, I'm such a bigot, right? So intolerant against bigots. Okay. And I even used the word to call them that. That makes me one, right? So I went, oh, wow. Okay. And then the next one was cruelty, we'll say. And I started laughing because I'm a mother of 4 children. I'm sure I've been thought of as cruel by all 4 of my children at one point or another when they didn't get their way. And then a third one, misuse of power. Again, I'm a parent, right? And so that day that I was doing this particular work for the very first time, I recalled an interaction I'd had with my oldest son. Called him up and I said, hey, Cameron, this morning when we were having that discussion about spring break and, you know, I was unhappy with that you weren't going to spend it with the family. Did you view that as guilt tripping? And he said, yeah. And I said, oh my gosh, that is such a misuse of power. I said, I am so sorry, Cameron. If you ever see me guilt tripping again for me to get my parental way, because I'm a parent and I can just tell you you're coming, I don't have to guilt trip you, right? I can actually use my power benevolently instead of using it in a misuseful, dysfunctional way, right? And I said, please call me out on it. He said, okay, Mom. And I said, I love you. I'm really sorry I did that. And he said, that's okay, right? And that was like this moment of repair with my child, a moment of repair in my own patterns of how I operate in the world. And my vice principal was my teacher for that. Being willing to go take that and say, okay, we all have the same traits. How do I do them? Now, if I'd gotten connected into the behavior instead of the traits, I would have said, I would never sexually abuse a child, which is accurate. I wouldn't, right? So that's where people get in trouble. In fact, you're in deep trouble if you ever say, I would never, because now you're on the judgmental roller coaster, right? And you're holding yourself up as judge and jury, and you're holding yourself up as higher than and better than. And so then this will repeat. So when I got that, here's the other thing, the third factor of forgiveness I would like to bring in from what you were saying, and that is that forgiveness and reconciliation are different. So I was able to forgive my vice principal by seeing that we actually have the same traits, but I do them differently. And he gave me an opportunity to be able to reorient myself as an adult in this world by doing that self-confrontation work. And I could forgive him. I didn't forgive his behavior. That's different. I did not condone his behavior. And I didn't call him up and say, hey, Mr. Johnson, we're exactly the same. Let's go have tea. I'd like to be your friend. So unless the person that has hurt you actually demonstrates safety and a contrition for what they did, and they're an important relationship to you, you do not do this. You have a good boundary with people that have hurt you. If they are demonstrating they're going to keep doing it over and over again, you don't get tangled up with them. But with that boundary, you have done your forgiveness work, and now you're not judging, you're doing your own growth. Now, when you see people doing the same thing, it's not going to trigger you as much. And you'll be able to say, oh, I know where they're at. I've been there. And you can have compassion for them plus a boundary. And that's what's so important. I think of all forgiveness work, this is the most important piece, is that you learn what you were meant to learn. You see yourself in the other, you forgive them without judging, holding yourself above and better than, and then you have a good boundary if reconciliation is not supposed to happen because they have not showed contrition and demonstrated safety.
That is fantastic. And I learned this from you when I was first out in practice and shadowing you in clinic. There was a patient who came in who had been terribly sexually molested by her father, was now well into adulthood with, I think, 3 children. And you said, you have to forgive him. And she just looked at you and said, what he did was unforgivable. And you just looked back at her and said, but what he did is still injuring you. It's not necessarily injuring him, and he's not my patient, but it is injuring you. There's components you even talk about in your dissertation that forgiveness has neurological benefit for the transgressed upon, and that really is our priority.
That's the priority.
On neurology.
Because the thing is that, you know, actually in Buddhism, they say, you know, don't forgive, dig 2 graves instead of 1. Mark Twain said, not forgiving is like you drinking rat poison and expecting the other guy to die. It keeps a toxicity in you, right? It keeps resentment. Yeah. Resentment is the enemy of resilience. Resentment eats away at the roots of the resilient tree. And so you cannot get better if you have that toxin coursing through your veins, and your nervous system will not relax, because as long as you consider yourself injured and victimized, your nervous system, in order to protect you, will stay hypervigilant. It will stay on and vibrating and looking for places where you could be unsafe. And then you will not get better.
Fabulous. Well, that was an hour. Do you have any last thoughts that you want to add?
I think we covered a lot of ground. Just remember that whatever's in your head goes to your bed.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being with us here today. We really appreciate your time and your attention and all of your wisdom. And maybe we'll do a part 2 at some point.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Partyfish Media.
Partyfish Media acknowledges that it operates and records on indigenous Duwamish and Puget Sound Coast Salish land that is still home to the Duwamish tribe. This land is stolen in violation of the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. We are committed to uplifting the name of these lands and community members from these nations who reside alongside us. For more information on this land, its people, or ways you can help, visit duwamishtribe.org or realrentduwamish.org.